We are going to talk about one of the most important topics of Azure, billing and cost management. Martijn, welcome.
Yes, welcome. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing well. How are you?
I am fine, thank you. So, before we start, can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah. So my name is Martijn Brant. I'm from the Netherlands. I work for a company called Portiva. I'm a cloud architect, which basically means I try to focus on Azure solutions, consultancy for end clients, and yeah, look at their cloud strategy and tactics when it comes to implementing or migrating towards Azure. So whatever it is, could be infrastructure or application modernization. That's mostly my focus. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, can you tell me about Azure billing? What can we
Yeah.
do to prevent costs?
Yeah. If you could switch to my slide. Yeah.
Sure.
Uh, so, like I said, I work at Portiva, based in the Netherlands, certified Azure architect. If you want to reach me on Twitter, here's my Twitter handle. Feel free to send me messages, whatever questions, whatever you want. Yeah, let's focus on cost management. So you asked about billing. This session would be about how we can get an insight as to what cost management is, as to what kind of cost we're currently having within Azure, how much money we're spending. It's not an unimportant subject for a lot of companies. So a lot of people they start their cloud journey without a clear frame or reference as to what cost is. So some people say the cloud is cheaper, some say it's more expensive. The baseline is it's different. The cloud offers a lot of flexibility when it comes to how to use it and how you can deploy it. So there's very little cost upfront. So if you compare it to, for instance, a more traditional data center, um, you have a lot of upfront cost. You have to guess on how much capacity you'll need, reserve that capacity, buy that capacity, and install it yourself. The cloud allows you to skip that entire process and just use whatever you want to use. But that's also a bit of a downside, or a bit of a trap, if you will. You can make a lot of costs real quick. So if you don't implement a proper governance framework, you'll see a lot of uh, growth within the cloud usage and the cost you're making. So it's really important to implement a governance framework. So as part of the Azure governance framework, as defined by Microsoft, cost management is one of those disciplines. So aside from cost management, we also have the security baseline here near the bottom, resource consistency, identity baseline, and deployment acceleration. That's basically the five principles, disciplines of the cloud governance framework uh, as defined by Azure. So when we're talking about cost management or Azure billing, we're mostly referring to one of these items within the cloud governance framework. So, when adopting the cloud, governance should be one of your top priorities when starting with the cloud. A lot of people they start from a technical mindset, or they start from how they should approach their project work, or their working methods, or whatever, and they don't really care about things like resource consistency, or how can you do security across a lot of different cloud frameworks. For instance, you're deploying a lot of different resources. You have, say, 10 teams working on different projects within Azure. You give all these people access to one or more than one resources or subscriptions, so they can deploy their own cloud resources. But if you're not careful, some of them will use a little bit of cost, and some of them will incur a lot of cost. And you always have to consider, well, is cost justified? what is cost? Um, Money spent, is it money spent well or not? So for instance, project A is incurring $1,000 a month, but project B is incurring $10,000 a month. Which is more expensive? It's not really that easy to answer that question. So for instance, if project A is wasting a lot of resources and their project isn't that far along, so they don't really have their basic principles in place yet, so they're not really at their first milestone within the cloud, you could say, one could argue that they're wasting money. But on the other side, the one that's spending $10,000 a month, if they have hit all their targets and all their goals, it could be very efficient. So, for instance, if you would compare that to a different deployment within perhaps another different cloud, or if you would do it on a more traditional data center, they probably wouldn't have that flexibility or growth or technical capabilities that they have right now. So that those $10,000 a month would seem like a lot of money, and well, basically it is, but it's money well spent, and that's a lot of value. So cost management and governance also pertains to that. So it's not really how much dollar is spending on your corporate credit card or whatever. It's also trying to identify who is using these resources, what kind of cost has occurred within these resources, and how can you keep a grip on their progress compared to their costs. So if their costs are in relation to their business projects, that could be fine. But if it's not, then you have to act. So that's one of the disciplines within the governance framework, cloud cost management. So if you take another step back and look at that journey towards cost management, how do you get there? How do you implement it? It starts with, how do you start within the cloud? Like I said, most people don't start with governance, but Microsoft always said, well, maybe you should have some kind of strategy before you try to adopt the cloud. So for this, Microsoft has created the Cloud Adoption Framework. So within this framework for Azure, they specify a number of modules or a pipeline, if you will, on how to approach this and how to adopt a good strategy towards the cloud. So one of the first steps is clearly have a clear motivation, know your business outcomes and your justifications. So like I said, when is money well spent? Well, money is well spent whenever you hit business objectives. When you said to yourself, well, at the end of 2020 or at the end of 2025, I want to be here and there with my business. So to get there, how do we get there? Well, we could start within Azure. So we could get the corporate credit card, run to portal.azure.com, sign us up, and see where we land. And honestly, that's one of the strategies some companies actually use. So they hear a lot of buzz about Azure and how it's technically very innovative, and they just start and see where they end. But when you're a bigger company and you want a more grip, more control on that progress, do look at the Cloud Adoption Framework. So within this framework, we have a number of modules defining our strategy, planning how we get there, making sure that we're ready to actually do something within Azure. So make sure we have like a baseline for proper control, management, reporting, support, security, all that stuff. And then you can look towards adopting Azure, whether it's being migration. So for instance, you take your on-premises virtual machines and you lift and shift those machines towards the cloud, or you start with something new. You start with an innovative new approach where you build new resources within Azure. So basically greenfield and try to adopt from scratch. But below these modules, there are two other modules. So there's governance and there's management. So within governance, we try to implement certain methodologies, but also benchmarks. So, like I said, when is money well spent? When do we actually hit those objectives? And governance is basically a reflection on your initial strategy. So it's basically saying, well, within our strategy, we set ourselves certain guidelines, or we set ourselves certain goals that we should reach, or the parameters within we're operating. So let's not try to use too much different technologies. Let's not try to spend unnecessary resources, or let's consolidate resources, stuff like that. So within governance, it's trying to stay clear, stay close to those objectives within the strategy. And management is making sure you're hitting your business commitments, but also your operation baseline, your operation maturity, which basically means, well, let's focus on um, getting it operation ready, making sure it's ready for production, making sure it's monitored, making sure it's ready. So that's in a nutshell. It's a bit of a step back from the subject cost management, but I always think it's very important to start with why do we do cost management? What is our motivation to do cost management? If your motivation is your finance department knocking on your door stating, well, I got this big fat bill from Microsoft, from Azure, stating you spent $50,000 on Azure last month. What's this? So if that's your primary motivation, perhaps also take a look at this governance framework and the cloud adoption framework to further get a grip on your Azure environment. So if financial or your credit card is your primary motivation to do cost management, try and reconsider all the other objectives within the governance framework. So making sure that it's secure, making sure that you're hitting your business objective, making sure it's efficient. That's in a bigger picture. So when we're looking at cost management, I like to define it within two parameters, if you will. One of them is cost control. So cost control is getting an insight as to what we're using. So that's in relation to Azure billing, for instance, like you just said. What are we currently using? What is this bill of $50,000 a month? What is it made of? What kind of projects are included and what projects aren't included? So that's basically cost analysis. I'll give a demo real quick in a few seconds, but I want to go over them in theory. So cost control and cost analysis, that's basically breaking down whatever you're using within Azure. There are techniques to further govern them. So one of those techniques is setting budgets and alerts for cost analysis. So for instance, you have a project group A and you have a project group B, and they're both working on different resources, and they both might be spending equal amounts of money within Azure, or they may be very different amounts of money within Azure. And it's not really a benchmark as to what which team is performing better. So the absolute cost isn't really an indicator as to what the value is to the business. So that's one of the things we have to consider. So when we look at those different resources, we have a number of ways of governing costs. So one of those ways is to implement tagging. Tags are little tags or metadata that you can assign to specific resources. So you can assign them to specific resource groups, or you can assign them to specific resources on a more recent resource level. You can implement tagging, and tagging can have a number of benefits. So one of those benefits is just to get an insight. But it can also be used within Azure automation. So for instance, one of the uses of tagging can also be when to patch something. So one of the resources within Azure automation is defining your update schedules based on the tags that are assigned to, for instance, virtual machines. So if there's a tag patched on Sunday, those machines would be patched on a Sunday and rebooted on a Sunday, without having to worry as to, well, what machine is doing what. So that's one example of tagging. But tagging can also help within a governance framework to identify resources. So when we're looking at all kinds of resource groups and all kinds of different subscriptions, it's sometimes easy to lose sight of what project is doing what. For instance, you could name your resource groups Project A, Software Component B. Well, that's one way of doing it, but most people assign their resource group names towards a more technical function as to the discipline that you're deploying. So, for instance, you have a finance software package and you want to deploy it within Azure. It's not unthinkable to have a resource name that's called RG underscore my finance package. That could be one of them. But that doesn't really state as to who's working on it, who's responsible for administrating it, or who's responsible for the cost. And also, one of those issues that you could have when you have misidentifying resources is you don't really have someone to bill. So, for instance, some companies they distribute the cost of IT to the specific departments that are using specific parts of IT. So, for instance, if I have a finance software or if I have a logistical piece of software, one could say, well, IT is responsible for all the costs of all software. So the IT costs could be really high. But what also happens is you could delegate those costs to the specific departments that are actually using those components and those resources. So by tagging those resources with the proper cost ownership, you can, for instance, create a report um, that further specify what costs are incurred on the Azure subscription by what specific project or tag or department. So, for instance, if I have a really big finance software that has huge database servers and processing servers to do all kinds of financial magic, but we also have a little bit of logistical software that does a little bit, is it really fair to give either the whole company a bill of $10,000 a month based on those two projects? Or is it more fair to look at, okay, what's software package A using and what is software package B using in cost? And should those costs be split within those two departments? Again, this is a more of a business challenge as to how you define costs and how you distribute costs within your company. But cost control and cost management can help you in this process, because at the end of the day, Microsoft will just bill you the total amount that's due. You have a big company, you have large costs, your Azure bill may be in the 10,000, 100,000, maybe in the millions. Could be. But if those costs incur and they are transacted from you to Microsoft, it doesn't really help you as to how you're managing those costs or what you should do to further improve or delegate that cost. So when your Azure subscription is still a couple of hundred, couple of thousands of dollars or euros or whatever big, that's not really an issue. But it's when you're passing those couple of thousands towards 10,000 euros or dollars, that's where you get the big problem. That's where you get corporate boards and financial businesses and financial departments and auditors complaining, well, what are those costs? What is this? Because giving the finance department one big fat bill that just says IT on it, it doesn't work. They'll refuse to pay it, and they want to know what it is. So by implementing a proper governance framework and thus cost management, we can implement certain A, restrictions, but also B, classifications or tagging, if you will.
So
So
basically, we can find who is responsible for the bill.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. So we can split it out. We can see what kind of resources, but it's not always just for the business. Not only just for the financial guys and gals, but it's also for the technical owners themselves. So if you want to further improve your application and you want to optimize how you use Azure efficiently, that can be a real tool to help you get insights as to what you're doing right and what you're not doing right. So that gives you some kind of, yeah, well, intelligence into Azure. So let me just quickly I'll tap into that.
May I ask you a question before we
Yeah, sure.
jump into? So you mentioned about subscriptions. So do those
Mhm.
change regarding to subscription types or are same?
Yeah, I'll answer that question a little bit later on when I have another
Okay.
overview when it comes to cost optimization. But it is important to know that subscriptions can also have influence on how cost management is performed. So not everyone knows this, but there are a lot of different types of subscriptions within Azure. So there are all kinds of different methods of paying for Azure. Microsoft doesn't really care as long as you pay them. That's basically the baseline for it. But there are different forms. So one of the easiest forms is getting a credit card and just sign up for Azure. That's what we call pay as you go. It's not really the most effective method of using Azure or paying for Azure because you are limited to whatever your credit card can do. Now, most credit cards have a specific limit, so if you would go over that credit card limit, you would have an issue. So to address that, Microsoft has, of course, volume licensing or volume agreements that allows you to get a direct agreement within towards Azure, towards Microsoft, and to have, for instance, a periodic billing based on just bank transfers, stuff like that. And one of the other ways is through the CSP. So that's the partner program Microsoft have, the cloud reseller program. Um, that's basically having a middleman, so like a reseller. A lot of partners do this because it adds value towards the customer, because it takes away one of those hurdles where they're not big enough to have volume licensing or volume agreements. But they do want to invest in Azure and they don't want to do it via credit card. So one of the specific characteristics of CSP subscription is, for instance, you can combine your services that you offer in relation to the resources that you're billing. So if I were a CSP partner, I could bill you for my services. So I'm an architect. I design stuff. I build stuff in Azure. So that takes time, and I can bill you for my time. But I can also bill you for the resources that you have within Azure because I have direct insight into what you're using. And a CSP partner basically pays Microsoft, and you have to pay the CSP partner. So that's one of the different ways Azure subscriptions are built. And it can happen that you have multiple Azure subscriptions. So especially when you're a bigger company with a lot of different business units, it's not uncommon to have different subscriptions. So one of the things that you see here within cost management and billing, so one of those ways that you can get there, let me just get it a bit bigger. Um, you can get when you're looking at the side menu, there's near the bottom here, there's cost management and billing. It's probably not the most sexy or enthusiastic aspect of Azure, but it's there. So when you click it, there are a number of different things you can see. It kind of depends on what kind of um, subscription you have, what kind of agreement you have, as to what you see here. So if you have multiple subscriptions, you could see multiple subscriptions. And also, one of those ways that you can group them together is via management groups. So you can bundle up different subscriptions and apply governance frameworks to multiple subscriptions at the same time. So, for instance, you're a bigger company, and let's say you have 20 different Azure subscriptions. spread around the world, then you can use the Azure Governance framework to implement cost management, but also certain Azure policies to guide you through governing all those different subscriptions. So, like I said, the governance framework, cost management is just a tiny bit of the governance framework, and you can really use all kinds of tools from it. Shouldn't be just be about cost management. So one of those ways you really look at, well, the most typical things you see here across billing on the left side is subscription, invoices, and payment methods. I think these are pretty self-explanatory. You get your subscription here as to what subscriptions you have and how they are built. You have your invoices. Well, this is really important for the financial people as to what is being paid and what isn't being paid, and of course your payment methods. But one of the things that we really want to look at is cost management. And you see, whenever you open cost management, you get a whole new interface. So basically, it's an interface within an interface. And it's important to know a little bit about cost management in Azure. It's an evolving service, if you will. So like all things within Azure, it's really growing really fast. Microsoft admitted some time ago that they could improve their billing and cost management experience. So they did. In the meantime, there were different companies implementing different strategies. So, for instance, for those CSP partners that I was talking about, there are a number of direct and indirect resellers of Azure that help you get more insight as to what cost management really is. So in the past, we didn't have all the tools that we have today. So you would resort to third parties to get these tools. One of those tools was Cloudin. You'll see references to Cloudin throughout Azure. Microsoft acquired Cloudin some time ago, and they're now continuously upgrading or integrating Cloudin within cost management. So if you look at it, Cloudin for CSP, like it says, it's being gradually replaced by Azure Cost Management. So from Microsoft's perspective, Azure Cost Management is really their go-to solution, and they want to further improve it. And to emphasize as to what they're doing and how they're doing it, there is a blog that I will link further on in the chat that explains what's new. And they are pretty active guys, so the guys and gals. So they're really working hard on improving this experience. So also, if you have some kind of feedback on them, it's really easy to get in touch with the cloud optimization and the cost management teams to get new features in. So one of the things that you can do is try preview. You can go to the preview portal where you get the latest features for cost management, or you can enable specific features here. So whatever is new, you can get the latest features right within the Azure portal. So some services within Azure are more of a gradual evolution, if you will, and some products really have a fast pace when it comes to development of the feature. So this is one of those more fast ones. So it really gets a lot of attention these days, and they're really active on it. So for some people it's not the most sexy subject, but it's one of the most necessary subjects. So that's where Microsoft focuses. So when we're looking at billing and cost management, well, billing is basically what I said earlier. This mostly refers to invoice and payment methods. So it's a necessary component. Sure, billing is important, but it doesn't really give you insight as to what's being billed. It's basically just one big fat number that's being charged on your credit card, and they say, good luck. So if you want to know more, we'll drill into cost analysis. So it always takes a little bit of time. So what you're seeing here is you always get an actual cost representation. So, for instance, this is one of my demo subscription. So it isn't really being used that hard. So the numbers are very low, but the actual cost currently right now to this date is 48 euros. But you also get a forecast view that you can get. Let me just Yeah. So you can get a forecast view. Just show it. Ah, there it is. So what Azure does, it looks at what you're using and what it's estimating that you're going to use. So this could be a great tool that can assist you into guessing what the cost at the end of the month will be. And they base this on a number of things. They base this on prior usage, but they also base it on whatever you're using right now. So if you're using a lot of virtual machines and those virtual machines are on 24/7, they can do a little bit of a projection as to where it might end up. So that's one of those ways that you can look ahead. It's not perfect. Of course, it doesn't anticipate business growth. It doesn't anticipate you optimizing the environment. So, for instance, if you shut down VMs at night, or if you only use VMs at a specific uh, point in the week. So, for instance, let's say you do development work from Monday through Wednesdays. It doesn't really take into account those kinds of schedules or routines, if you will. So it's kind of smart, but it's also kind of dumb. So my advice would be don't really look too blindly on this number because there are way too many numbers that can influence on how high this would end up. So what's more important is looking at what's really being used. So one of those ways is we can look at the resource group names. So we can, of course, near the top of our screen, we can filter. So we can use all kinds of filters that we want to use. So let's say I want to only see from a specific billing period or a specific resource or a tag. We could do that. So, for instance, if I want to look at a specific tag, I want to know what the Azure Cloud Shell is using in cost, because every time when you click this little Cloud Shell icon, you get a warning saying, "Well, I'm going to create a little bit of temporary storage. This could incur costs," and it does actually. So it's not much. It's probably in the cents. If this number grows to euros or multiple dollars, I'd be surprised. So basically, what this is cost for storing your cloud drive. So if you download something to your cloud drive, it will get billed there. So you can see it's only based on storage. There's nothing else. So that's why we use tags. Those tags, in this case, Microsoft has automatically tagged this resource, but you could, of course, manually tag to whatever you want. There are a number of views that you can do here. One of the default view and the most used view is, of course, accumulated cost. But you can also look at, for instance, daily cost. And this will give you a good insight as to what's going on. So, for instance, because this is one of those demo or test environments that I have, you can see that mostly throughout October and November, I wasn't really using it. But earlier this week, I created a new extra resources within specific resource groups that would incur additional costs. So this gives you a day-by-day view as to what's going on. So if you're seeing peaks on this graph, if you will, or bar chart, that you're not really expecting, then you could really drill into it, saying, well, why did my cost increase on the 23rd? What's going on here? Why is this bar growing, and why is this going down? That's well, we need to check that out. One of those ways we can check it out is to say, for instance, cost by resource. So here we can get an overview as to what really is so expensive within our subscription. Well, when I say expensive, don't really look too much at the 48 euros. It's not really expensive, of course, but imagine that this will be 100 times higher. Then it will be more important. Or if it was 1,000 times more higher, then it would really be important. So if we want to look at the top resources that are using the cost within this subscription, one of those ways is looking at it by cost by resource. And this gives you an overview as to what's more expensive. So for instance, you would say a virtual machine would take up a lot of money, but a virtual machine only incurs costs when they are actually switched on. So if I turn my virtual machines off when I don't need them, I don't really incur costs. I do incur storage. So for instance, you see here that the disk of this VM, with a great name, by the way, the storage for this virtual machine is more expensive than the virtual machine itself. That's mostly because I'm using a premium SSD storage. So that basically means that I get billed for the entire month that VM is created. So as long as that VM is alive, or if you will, stored on Azure, I will get billed. And when it's premium SSD storage, I will get billed the entire amount. So just a quick look into storage and how cost works on storage. If I were to use, for instance, hard drive storage, I only get billed for what I use. So if I store 20 gigabytes, I will pay for 20 gigabytes. But when I use premium SSD storage, and I choose the option for 128 gigabytes of SSD premium storage, I would have to pay the entire 128 gigabytes. Regardless, if I just store 1 byte on it, it doesn't matter. I have to pay the entire disk. So looking at that could also be a cost optimization strategy, keeping in mind that slower storage is, of course, well, slower because they're basically either standard SSDs or the standard hard drives. So that could be really slow. So if it's more of an archival function, that doesn't really matter. But one of those other considerations, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on, is when you're not using premium SSD, you might not get an SLA on the uptime of the virtual machine. You need premium SSD to get that service level agreement from Microsoft, to get that insurance that it would be available for you. But one of the other components that really incurs cost is, for instance, the virtual network gateway. Well, for instance, I took the least expensive option that they have in Azure, but this solution also has downsides. So if I want to look into that, you can see here that the SKU that's incurring the cost is the basic SKU. So that's the cheapest version of this resource that I can implement. But that also has technical limitations. There are things that I can do with this virtual machine gateway, with this virtual network gateway, that I could do with a more expensive version, for instance. So just basically just looking at what kind of SKU this is or how much it costs isn't the total picture. Sometimes you need to spend that money to get the functionality that you really need. So you can't really save on it. So do keep in mind when you're looking at cost by resource, and you filter by the most expensive. So for instance, my virtual network gateway is the most expensive within this whole subscription. That doesn't mean that I could downgrade it. So that's something to keep in mind. But it's also something to consider. So that's basically cost analysis, if you will. So you can really look at what you're using, how you're using it, how much money is it costing, and if you want a more overview as to what kind of type of solutions that you're spending money on, this is also a good view to get out of it. So for instance, when I look at this, I could see I'm spending a little bit amount of money on virtual networking, I'm spending a lot more on storage, and I'm spending a lot more on virtual VPN gateway, if you will. So this also gives you another type of representation. So whenever someone's asking you, are we spending too much money on virtual machines? This is one of those views that can really help you investigate on what's eating the most. Then we have cost alerts, and we have budgets. So what we can do is we can set specific budgets to specific items or subscriptions. So for instance, what I can do is I can look at the cost data of this subscription. I can change the scope if I want, so I can drill down into the individual resource groups, if you will. So let's say I just want to look at the billing for this resource group. I can select that, or I can add specific filters. And this is where tags are again really important, because they allow you to set specific filters for the budget scoping. So what you can do is on the right, you get an overview as to what the actual costs are and what the forecast is for the next few months. So Microsoft is kind of guessing, well, your costs were lower in the previous months, and it's going up. So they're estimating that your budget will probably increase. So it says to you, well, last month you spent 48, and you in the last 7 months you never spend more than 50. And we'll project that you'll probably hit 92 euros. So that's one of those ways that you can get an idea as to what you were using in the past and what you're currently using right now. I can set a budget. So let's say a test budget. And that doesn't include spaces. And you can look at how you want to look at billing. So for instance, most people look at the billing month. So that's when you're billed by Microsoft. It really depends on what kind of subscription you have. Some people are billed on the 1st, and some people are billed on whenever the subscription was built. So for instance, if I were to sign up for Azure today, my billing period would start on the 26th and it would end on the 25th. So that's one thing to keep in mind. It doesn't always align with calendar months. That's something to keep in mind. You can set a creation date or an expiration date, whatever you want, and you can set a budget. So for instance, let's say I want a budget of 60 euros, and I can set alerts of that. So when I hit 90% of $60 or 60 euros, I would get an alert. And I can assign specific action groups to that. So action groups are things that you can do that run whenever a specific item is being hit. And you can do specific actions whenever those action groups are activated. So for instance, you can run an automation runbook, or you can run an Azure function. Or you can hit a webhook, for instance. So if you want to alert on your help desk system, so for instance, you use some kind of system, ServiceNow or TopDesk or whatever, to keep a track of your support tickets. You can automate the creation of support tickets whenever you reach a specific point of your budget. So it's not only emails, but it can also be automation. So for instance, whenever the project team that's using the very expensive servers, say they have servers with rendering cards or video cards on them, and they're doing a lot of machine learning and deep learning and all kinds of fancy stuff, whenever they hit a budget of 50%, I want to shut down half of their machines. And whenever they hit a budget of 90%, I want to shut down nearly all of their machines. It's a bit strict. Not most businesses don't use it, but it could could be very useful for yourself. So it's not only limited to email. That's one of the takeaways. That you can also use automation within alerts. So you can always also get alerts via email. So enter your email address here, and you'll get a notification whenever you get near the 90% threshold, for instance, and when you hit the actual budget. Keep in mind, budgets aren't hard limits. They only are there to help guide you. They don't restrict anything. There is no option currently to set hard limits on specific budgets. So whenever a budget is reached, it doesn't really behave like a credit card. Whenever you hit the limit of your credit card, it mostly goes on lock. But for instance, when you overdraw an account, sometimes it can go really far. So if you're not careful and you give too many machines to too many people and they use too many resources, it really is possible to get a $100,000 Azure bill if you're not careful. So for instance, say someone is working with Azure Automation to scale up their environment whenever it's needed, whenever more resources are needed, and they miswrote their automation script. It's very, very possible that you create 1,000 machines that incur all kinds of costs. That's entirely possible. So keep in mind, budgets are a soft limit, not a hard limit. That's basically the takeaway. And the cost alerts are basically just the alerts from those budgets. So whenever you hit one of those limits that you set, you'll get an alert here, as well as to an alert in the email or the automation that you triggered. So yeah, that's cost analysis, if you will. So that's when we look at cost control. That's basically what I was talking about the last 30 minutes. Mert, do you have any questions relating to cost control before we move on to cost optimization?
Though, but I wonder about the Azure pricing calculator. Does it really help?
Yeah, so one of those things is that you can use within Azure is the calculator pricing. So not everyone really knows this feature, but what it does, it creates a shopping cart. So before you even start working within Azure, so if you're just considering Azure, you can already get an insight as to what your costs will be. Of course, this is based on the retail pricing. Whenever you have a special pricing agreement with Microsoft, those prices wouldn't be reflected in here. One tip, though, if you go to the top right corner and you log into your account associated to specific discounts, it is possible that you select near the bottom as to what kind of prices programs you want to look at. So, for instance, the Microsoft Online Services Agreement, the Enterprise Agreement, or the MCA, and that can influence the pricing of those. What you're seeing here. So let me just quickly reset this estimate. So basically, like I said, it's basically just a shopping cart that you can add specific resources to. So for instance, let's say we want to run a virtual machine. Well, scroll down and we'll see the virtual machines. You can also rename this. So for instance, if I want to have a virtual machine for my financing server, I can use this tool to estimate what the cost will be. So you can define all kinds of parameters. So for instance, what kind of VM you're using really has influence on the price. That's pretty obvious. I'm not going into detail as to what all these different types are, but keep in mind there are very large differences between those. And by default, you'll see a number 730. That's a recurring a number within Azure. Basically, Microsoft said, well, 1 month is 730 hours. That's basically their metric of a month. You can also change it to 1 month if you want. That's more easy. So here we have two options that I will explain a little bit more later on, but you can use reserved instances that will give you a discount on the pricing. So, for instance, when you say, well, I know for sure that I want to use this for an entire month, then I get over for an entire year, then you'll basically get a discount. So you're committing yourself to Microsoft that you want to use this resource for at least a year. So they give you a 32% discount. If you want to reserve for 3 years, you get a 57% discount. The numbers really fluctuate. Sometimes you get really high discounts, sometimes not that much. It's not really, you can't really say it's 25 and 50% because sometimes it's less and sometimes it's more. So really depends. By default, most pricing within Azure also includes the licensing. So when you use a Windows VM on Azure, you also get a license for Windows. So you don't need to run out and buy licenses for Windows. And you don't even have to go to Microsoft for a specific licensing agreement. So when you had your servers in your office, or when you had your servers in a data center, you always had those yearly talks with Microsoft where you discussed, well, I have 50 VMs or I have 1,000 VMs that all run Windows and all need licensing. And then Microsoft says to you, well, you run 1,000 copies of Windows Server. Well, let's negotiate a price, we'll rubber stamp it, and then you're done. You don't really have to license each independent server, but you'll volume license most often. For Azure, they went down a different path. They basically said, well, the retail pricing includes the licensing, so that's an upside. But what happens if you already paid for those servers within your data center, or if you want to migrate those servers from your data center towards the cloud? Do you have to throw away your old license, or can you reuse your license? So that's where Azure Benefit really comes into play, where it says, well, the operating system is now free. They won't incur your cost for the license because you're agreeing with Microsoft that you've already paid for the license of this server. So let's say you signed a 5-year contract or a 3-year contract with Microsoft, say a year ago, and you want to migrate towards Azure. Then you can use this feature to reduce the cost of hosting on Azure. So you can see if I select pay-as-you-go, license included, then I would pay $152. But if I were to reserve this VM for a year, and if I already have the license, then it's only $57 a month. And that's where most business cases or cost predictions of Azure are either made or broken when you're looking at the licensing cost. So is Azure cost effective? Well, it depends. If you're just looking at the standard retail pricing, and if you're looking at, well, what am I getting exactly for this resource? So I get 2 virtual CPU cores, 8 gigabytes of RAM, and 50 gigabytes of temporary storage. And that has to cost $152. But that's not really the total picture. So don't look too blindly at the cost. One other website that I can wholeheartedly recommend is called azureprice.net. It's I believe it's a third-party website. I'm not really sure as to who maintains this software, so it's not an official Microsoft website, but do take a look at it because it offers all kinds of different graphs. So for instance, average price per region or VM performance, but I use it mostly to compare cost. So let's say I'm in West Europe, one of the more expensive regions, and I want to pay in euros. I can select that I want to use cost per hour or, for instance, cost per month. That's the most used metric. And I can, for instance, say, well, I need 4 CPU cores and I need a little bit of RAM, say 12 gigabytes of RAM. And now I only get those VMs that actually have the specifications that I really need. So within Azure, there are all kinds of different VMs, and they all have different performance characteristics. So some of them are more slow, and others are faster, or some of them are more burstable by nature. I'll discuss burstable later on, but keep in mind that although those prices may be similar here, that doesn't really mean they have the same technical features. But this website does give you a good overview as to when you're looking at a 4-core 12 gigabyte system, what your options are and what the differences in costs are, without having to look through the entire calculator and having to look to, well, I need 4 cores. Well, just in this list alone, again, yeah, we'll basically go through it and look at what systems have 4 cores, but it's a bit of a mess. So this calculator assumes that you know what kind of VM you need, and if you want to know what kind of VM you need, you really need to look at the documentation. There are really cool documentation pages as to that explains what these sizes are. They explain what those numbers are, or for instance, what a B series or A series or D series. Um, so look at the documentation for that reference. So that's basically the calculator. The calculator has all kinds of different services, so you can implement basically anything that can be implemented within Azure can also be used within this calculator. It's a really powerful tool. Any more questions, Matt?
Yes, and I want to ask about the Azure advisors. It's always pop up whenever I open the Azure portals. So,
Yeah,
what is Azure advisor?
yeah. Let's look into that. It's on this page, so I'll get to that when I near the middle of this page. So previously we were looking at cost control, and now we're looking at cost optimization. So now we know what's costing us so much money. How can we save a little bit of money? I'm of course Dutch. I'm from the Netherlands. We're really known for being, well, economical. Let's put it to that. So cost optimization is a really a priority for a lot of people. So you ask yourself, how can we further optimize cost? How can we get that credit card bill down to a more acceptable level, or more in line with what the business expected, or what was promised at the start of our cloud journey? We estimated using the Azure calculator, if you will. We said, well, we're basically going to use $5,000, and we ended up at 7,000. How can we transform 7,000 into $5,000? That's basically what we're doing with cost optimization. Now, one of those more obvious points is try looking to software as a service and platform as a service. So when, for instance, looking at virtual machines, it's really tempting to just buy or rent a server, sort of like a virtual machine, install your own operating system, install your own software, and do whatever you want, just like you know you've always done it. That's the way you did it in your data center. That's the way you did it in the last 25 years. But that's not really the way to do it in the cloud. Software as a service and as platform as a service really has that benefit, economics of scale. So, for instance, one of those prime examples would be email. How many people do you know that still run an email server? The answer is probably very few, because email is a commodity. We compare it to water out of the faucet. So whenever you turn on your faucet, you expect water to flow out. Whenever you use Outlook or whatever email client you use, you expect your email to be there. You don't really want to bother by looking at Exchange servers or antivirus solutions or archiving solutions, all kinds of stuff related to it. So most companies already move towards Office 365 or Microsoft 365 these days, or Gmail, for instance. That's one of those options. So for email service, it's a bit of a no-brainer. Move to SaaS. But for instance, what do you do with your file server? Say you still have that file and printer server, often called FPS1 or something, or file server, most applicable name, that still has those massive network shares on it. That's always the way you've done it. That's always how you know you do it. And that's the way your customers use it. So one of those ways that you can optimize that is, for instance, moving that to SharePoint. But SharePoint might not always be the most optimal solution. You might need file access level to all those different solutions. OneDrive has evolved these days. These days you have those on-demand features that emulates a hard drive, like the files are actually on your hard drive, but they aren't really there. But it's still not always the solution for type of file or storage, whatever you want. So one of those ways that you can use a file server differently is using Azure Files. Azure Files is a platform as a service. So it's basically just a file share, but it's hosted in the cloud. So you don't really have to worry on what server it's hosted on. You don't have to worry about how much disk space should you reserve, how much antivirus solutions or a patching of the server. All those things you don't really have to worry about, because when you use Azure Files, you just pay for what you use. So if you say, well, I want to store 50 gigabytes of data, you don't really have to pay for an entire VM with an operating system and all kinds of management software. You just pay for those 50 gigabytes, and that's it. So moving away from your file server towards that Azure file services with all kinds of different pricing models and performance models, it can really benefit and really save you money. So if you were to look at Azure and scale your file server, say you have a 2 terabyte file server on premises, maybe it contains a lot of legacy data, could be. And if you're looking at a 2 terabyte hard drive for VM within Azure, and you want to use a service level agreement with Microsoft, and you have to use premium SSD storage to get that support that you need, then a 2 terabyte VM within Azure, it's really expensive. So, but storing 2 terabytes of data on Azure Files really isn't when you look at it. So moving to SaaS and optimizing towards PaaS, that's really the key difference within Azure. It really allows you to optimize that. And if you are moving from on-premises to the cloud, perhaps first lift and shift your virtual machines towards Azure. So you grab your virtual machines and you migrate them towards Azure exactly as is. And then you can start the optimization progress towards those platform services, towards those software as a service solutions. So that's one of the most obvious takeaways. The other is hybrid use benefit. Well, that's what I said earlier. You can reuse your prior investments to licensing with Microsoft to further drive down the cost of your Azure resources, because you don't really have to pay for the license twice. It's not only based around the operating system, it also applies to, for instance, SQL Server. So if you've already paid a lot of money for those SQL Server licensing on premises, you can reuse that licensing within Azure to spin up a SQL VM or a SQL database or SQL managed instance, for instance. Then right sizing or Azure Advisor, like you said, Mert. Right sizing is getting it right, and it's kind of hard. So what I was talking to you about earlier about how do you know what VM is right for you? So what a lot of companies do, or a lot of system admins do, is you buy your data center services. So whatever you run on premises, you buy that one time. So for instance, you buy a big fat VMware solution or a big fat Hyper-V solution that contains 150 CPU cores and a lot of terabytes of memory. When you're not using those resources, you're basically wasting money because the servers are doing nothing. So when you're running VMs on premises, you want to kind of oversize them, if you will. So really use that platform really well. But when you're moving towards the cloud, you want to do the opposite. You want to really look at what you're doing and what you actually need. So for instance, when you have a VM on your data center platform and you migrate that to Azure, it doesn't really have to be an 8-core, 32 gigabytes of RAM machine anymore. Perhaps a quad core, so like 4 cores and 12 gigabytes of RAM could be enough, perhaps. So there are two ways to get an insight in this. One of them is Azure Advisor. Azure Advisor is basically a service that runs in the background of your Azure environment. It's free of cost, so it's just included within Azure. And it has a number of categories. So for instance, it looks at cost, security, reliability, operational excellence and performance. I unfortunately don't really have the best demo for this because I currently have no cost recommendation. But if you look into those documentation pages for cost optimization, what it actually does is it checks your virtual machines as to what they're actually doing. So let's say you migrated that 8-core machine from your data center towards Azure. And Azure is really looking at it and saying, well, you're basically using only 2 or 3 or 4 cores of that big fat server. So it's really oversized on Azure. So it doesn't really have to be that big. So Azure Advisor will give you a cost alert stating, well, hey, this virtual machine might be oversized. It doesn't really take into account what the future use will be. So for instance, if you only do development work once a month or once a quarter, so once every 3 months you work on a specific project, and then you need all the processing power that you actually need. It doesn't really take into account all kinds of stuff. It really the service mostly relies on you having to use it 24/7 and it being constant use or like daily use peaks, if you will. One of those other alerts that you will get from cost is if you're wasting resources. So for instance, a virtual machine can use a public IP address. And what happens if you throw away a resource, but you forget to delete the resources associated to that resource? So for instance, when I look at my resource groups, and I look at my test VM. My test VM, of course, is the virtual machine, which incurs a lot of cost. But it also includes a disk. So if I were to delete the virtual machine, but I don't delete the disk associated to that machine, I would still get billed for this disk, because Azure doesn't really know that I want to throw this away. Perhaps I only want to throw away the machine, but I want to retain the disk for ownership later on. Or I want to recreate the virtual machine later on using this disk as a sort of template, if you will. Azure doesn't know this. Azure just knows that, hey, you're using a disk with this virtual machine. You deleted the virtual machine, but you didn't delete the disk. So that could be a cost optimization by deleting the disk. So looking at Advisor, it's a really great service. It really gives an insight as to what your subscription is doing and how you can further optimize that. But you also have to take it with a grain of salt, because it isn't perfect. It doesn't know your usage patterns, or it doesn't really know your intentions. It just gives you like a nudge, like an alert saying, well, hey, you could do this, but it doesn't really always have to be the most applicable. So keep that in mind. So that's right sizing. Like I said, there were 2 ways of right sizing. That's one of them. Azure Advisor being, well, an advisor giving you like a nudge saying, well, hey, you could optimize it. One of the other ways is using Azure Migrate. Azure Migrate is a service free of charge from Microsoft that helps you to look at what you're currently using on premises and how you can best implement that within the cloud. So one of those examples is virtual machines within Azure Migrate. So what you do is you install a piece of software from Microsoft that links towards Azure. And what it does, it looks at your data center and how much of your data center usage, so like virtual machines or resources or all kinds of stuff you're currently using, and it sends that reporting data towards Azure. And for instance, let's say you have like an 8-core CPU VM on premises on your data center. It can look at long-term performance data. So it can collect all kinds of performance parameters, if you will. So for instance, the CPU usage. And it can monitor for long-term. So for instance, like a month. And if it shows that within 1 month, you really haven't used that VM that much, where your prior system admin always said, well, this is the most important VM ever, and we need to give that a lot of resources. Azure Migrate is one of those ways as to looking to validate that claim, to look at what is actually using and what you could perhaps use within Azure. So that 8-core VM could probably be optimized towards a 4-core or a 2-core VM, which basically, well, saving you a lot of money. Because if you fill in the Azure calculator using the numbers that you currently have, then Azure is really expensive. But if you run Azure Migrate, for instance, for like a month, and again, this is completely free of charge. You don't have to commit to anything. You can just run it. And if you still think Azure is not a match for you, you can just throw it away. That's no issue, no commitment, whatever. So you're free to try. Perhaps a good idea for another session, but it gives you some kind of insight. So right sizing, you can do it before you do the migration, or you can do it after the migration, whatever you choose to do. The second of the second to last is reserved instances, what we talked about earlier. If you indicate to Microsoft that you want to run a specific service for a long time, so for instance, you have a financial server that you know you're going to run for the next year or another 3 years on Azure. My advice is always, well, let's see how it starts. Yeah? Let's see if it's a fit for the business. But say the software is running for the last 3 months and it's working great and everyone's happy and it's a long-term solution. You know you're going to be using the virtual machine for a long time. So why not commit to using that VM for a long time? And you can purchase a reserved instance token, if you will. So it's basically you committing yourself to Microsoft, and in exchange you get a nice discount on it. It also includes the licensing costs. You also get a discount on the licensing, if you will. It's not only for virtual machines, it's also for other services. So for instance, storage or SQL Server are other solutions that can be committed to for a long time. So if you know you're going to store a lot of data within a database, for instance, you can say, well, I need this database for a long time, and you can buy reserved instance. You can swap them out, but it's a bit of a gray area. Microsoft isn't a big fat villain or something that wants to take away all your money and reserve everything for you and don't give you your money back if you don't want it. If you ask them kindly, they will swap your reserved instances to something else. So if you made a mistake within for right sizing your VM, for instance, your new financial software, the performance isn't that great, you need to upgrade that VM. You can swap the token towards a different reserved instance that has more power, for instance. And for instance, if you also want to throw away a server, but you want to also create a server, you can swap that reserved instance token to the other service, if you will. So there are a bit of rules when it comes to reserved instances, but it can be a really great tool to save you like 25 or 50% of the cost on Azure, and that's really important. One other point that you can do is you can turn off resources. Like I said, the virtual machine that I showed you, when it's turned off, I don't have to pay anything. But the disk I'm using to store the data for that virtual machine, that always has to be paid, because that data can be turned off. The data has to be stored on Azure. The only way that I can take away the storage cost, if I were to back up the VM towards my local PC or somewhere else, and then delete the entire resource in Azure, then I have zero cost. But if I only turn off the virtual machine, then I can really save money on the compute cost. So often the compute costs are higher than the storage cost. My demo that I gave earlier isn't really representative because I rarely use that VM. But there are a number of ways that you can automate the shutdown or the power on of the machines. So when you consider working hours, say for instance, from 8 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock in the afternoon or the evening, if you want, for Mondays through Fridays. So that's working hours in most countries. For 5 days, 8 or 10 hours. That's only 33% of the entire week. 66% is based in the evening the night and the weekend. So if you have services that don't need any power or compute or whatever during those off hours, you can turn off those services and perhaps scale down your cost. So one of those examples, for instance, is Windows Virtual Desktop, which is basically a remote desktop services platform for Microsoft within Azure. You create your own workspace servers and you scale up on depending on how many servers you need to host your number of remote workers. So, for instance, during 2020, we saw a huge spike in remote working because, well, it's the pandemic, and this incurs a lot of cost. But people still have days off. People still only work during the normal work hours. They don't work middle of the night, and they don't work at weekends, most of them, either way. So, for instance, if you have to support 1,000 users on your infrastructure during working hours, you need a lot of more compute. But if you have, for instance, 50 users during the night or during the weekend, you can scale down your servers hosting that application or platform, if you will. So you can save an additional 66% of your cost by just turning stuff off. It doesn't really always apply. Some services always have to be running. So, for instance, if you have an Active Directory server, it always has to be running. If you have file services, it probably always has to be running. So it doesn't really apply to all cases, but it does happen. And you really have to consider it when you're creating a solution. When you're using a software as a service solution or a platform service, you don't really have to take these instances, these considerations near the bottom as much as when you use the platform service, because a platform service already accounts for more dynamic workloads. And Azure File Share doesn't really matter, doesn't really care if you use it at 3 a.m. in the morning or if you're using it 3 p.m. in the afternoon. It doesn't really matter. You get billed for what you use, not when you use it. So that's basically the takeaway. Second page, cost optimization, reducing cost. Like I said, type of subscription can really matter. You have, for instance, enterprise agreements, CSP, or pay-as-you-go. Pay-as-you-go is by far the most expensive way that you can use Azure. When you're just starting out, or if you just want to get a feeling of Azure, it's great. Grab your company credit card, ask your IT manager for permission. Yeah, probably. Sign up for Azure and try new stuff. Sure, go ahead. There also are trial modes. So there are like $200 vouchers from Microsoft. They can just try. So you can just sign up for a trial account and just do whatever you want for $200 for free. But pay as you go attached to a credit card is really one of the bad ways to do it, because it's basically the worst price that you can get from Microsoft. It's the retail price that you get from the Azure calculator. That's basically like the MSRP, the Microsoft with the suggested retail price, if you will, the manufacturer retail price. It's like going to a big TV store and they say, well, this TV costs $4,000, but if you buy it today, you get it for $2,000. Yeah, someone at marketing sometimes once upon a time suggested that a TV should be $4,000, but it doesn't really mean it's worth $4,000. Often it's on sale for $3,000 or $2,000, but the retail price, the suggested retail price, is $4,000. So yeah. Buying pay-as-you-go resources in Azure is really the most expensive way. When you look at CSP, you can already get a discount from some partners. Or added values. So, for instance, you get operational support added with that price sometimes. It really depends on the partner that you're using. And if you're really investing within Azure and you're really using those resources, try and talk to Microsoft or your partner for instance, an enterprise agreement or a volume license agreement where you can negotiate price, where you can reduce the cost of your project. And also Microsoft has special pricing, for instance, if you support non-profits or charity events. So if you are a 100% charity, feel free to contact Microsoft for some kind of special arrangement, because they often do. They often do sponsor nonprofits or charities if their cause is noble and they are registered and all kinds of stuff. So they really want to see that adoption on that modern framework, on that modern Azure cloud platform. So they're more than happy to give you like a specific discount or specific budget that you can use within those companies. Azure regions, like I said, Azure regions really does matter. When I look at this website again, azureprice.net, this is one of those really nice charts. So, like I said, I'm based in West Europe, which is by far the most expensive region to be located in. So, when you look at this graph, the graph is really isn't really representative of anything. But let's say a normal resource would cost about $1. Then in West Europe, something would cost $1.1. But when you go down the scale, you get all kinds of different resources or regions within Azure. You do have to keep in mind that not all resource types, so like the Azure services, are available in every region. So West Europe, for instance, is one of those more feature-rich, more of a premium region for Microsoft that has all the bells and whistles that you want, but it's also the most expensive. But for instance, East US 2 is also one of those premium regions that also has nearly all the Azure services that you want, but it costs 1.5 or 1.55 on the dollar. So when you compare East US 2 to West Europe is really expensive, and it all has to that really has to do with market situations, local governance, data line connections, all kinds of stuff. All kinds of stuff can influence the price. So the prices differ from region to region. A VM isn't as expensive, say, for instance, in America compared to Europe. Somehow this makes sense, but on other scales it doesn't really make sense. So consider using the region, not always using the region that's closest to you. So you might be inclined to say, well, I'm based in the Netherlands, let's use West Europe. Well, if there's a really latency specific reason to do this, so if you want the lowest latency towards Azure, then adopt West Europe if you're based in the Netherlands. But if latency isn't the biggest issue, you could, for instance, consider North Europe. North Europe, although it's called North Europe, it isn't based in Scandinavia. It's based in Ireland. So North Europe is the Microsoft name of Ireland. So these data centers are still within the European Union. So if you're really concerned about data residence or governance or government regulations, most of them still apply in Ireland. So because it's part of Europe, you have the guarantee from the European Union and from Microsoft that your data has to comply with the same rules. So let's say I'm from the Netherlands, and I know that West Europe, for instance, this is called Amsterdam, this is the Netherlands. Yeah, that's they call it West Europe, but it's basically the Netherlands. It's way more expensive compared to North Europe, but they are in the same European zone. So consider that if you don't need the lowest possible latency for your application, you could consider hosting services in North Europe to save, well, easily 40% of your costs right there. So that's something to consider. But do keep in mind that you have to consider latency, you have to consider governance, and consider government regulations. If you have, for instance, financial data, or if you have healthcare data, you might have to comply to local law, and local law may direct you to a specific region. So yeah, keep that in mind. Also, keep in mind, if you want to run just a few labs for yourself, so for instance, if you want to toy around with Azure and you want to do a little proof of concept work, try opting for the more cheaper regions, as this would last your budget a bit longer. That's Azure Region. One of those other things that you can do is you can consider using other types of resources. So, for instance, there are virtual machines. They call it the B series. B series. Those are burstable virtual machines. So what they do is when you take a virtual machine at Azure, they guarantee you a specific amount of cores and amount of performance. So for instance, if you take a DS4 VM, you get more performance than an A4 VM, for instance. A B series can be really interesting because the cost of a B series is way lower. Often it's like 50% more economical. It's 50% cheaper. But it has a trade-off. They guarantee a specific number of cores. You get a VM with that number of cores, but you don't get that performance. So if you have 4 cores, the maximum performance that you can get is 400% compared to a specific core. But the base performance that you get is 90%. So that's 90% of one core. So you're losing a lot of performance. So basically you're getting 1/4 of the performance for half price. So you could say, well, this is a bad deal. Why would you do this? It uses a credit system. So basically you'll start with an initial number of credits. And whenever you don't use that VM that much, you basically get a credit. So it's like a point system. So if you don't need performance, you get points. But if you do need performance, you can exchange those points for more performance, up to 400% of one core. So for instance, if I know my application needs a quad-core VM, but it only uses that performance whenever I do like a compute run. If I have a financial application and we do once a month, we do all kinds of billing processing, and that takes a couple of hours every month or a couple of hours every week. It's like a burstable performance characteristic. So you can use this burstable VM to score credits when you don't need them, and you can exchange the credits when you need the performance. So is it applicable to every VM that you have? No, you have to keep in mind that some workloads need more performance than that you can get from this. So you use up all your credits and you fall back to that 90%. So your 4-core VM all of the sudden performs like you have one single core in your VM. So keep in mind when you use burstable machines too often or too long, the performance really goes down hard. So keep that in mind. That's just something that you can do. But if you have like a burstable workload, burstable VMs can be really a cool way to save money. And same basically applies to storage. Like I said, the disk of your virtual machine, the managed disks, for instance, they have a number of tiers. The highest tier is premium SSD storage, which has the best performance. But under that, you also have standard SSDs. And under that, you have standard hard drives. Hard drives, for instance, are the slowest. But if it's a VM that's not really using its hard drive that much, so boot up may be slow, but other than that, it's just for, say, archival storage that only gets used once a month or once a year, and performance doesn't really matter, you can use hard drive. So keep in mind, if you use the cheaper storage, you of course the slower storage, it will be cheaper when it comes to cost. But you have to keep in mind the performance that you need, and you also have to keep in mind the SLA. So if you want a service level agreement on your virtual machines, you have to use premium SSD storage. That's basically one of those guidelines. Or the application has to be split over multiple machines. So for instance, when you're using a distributed compute solution or a load balance solution in a skill set or a virtual machine set, then the SLA could be 99.99% without using premium SSD. But if you're just using a standalone VM, if you want any kind of support on that from Microsoft, you have to use Premium SSD. So keep that in mind. And the last two things that I want to talk about is Azure Spot and Azure Batch. It's basically two ways of getting cheap compute from Azure. So Azure Spot is a way for you to get compute services when they're not really needed. So you can set rules for when you want to use your virtual machines. So for instance, when the cost is low, so for instance, during outside of business hours, during off hours, during nights, during weekends, when other machines on Azure aren't really being used that much, Microsoft will offer you lower prices on spot VMs. But keep in mind, whenever other machines need that performance back, so for instance, it's Monday morning, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, people get to work, the servers get hammered with all kinds of new processes, your VM will be the first to be shut down because you set a specific rule that whenever cost will be too high, you get evicted from that platform. So your VM would shut down. Using Azure Spot is a bit of a niche, if you will. It's a great way to get cheap compute, but yeah, it really depends on your workload. Yeah, it has to be a workload that can be shut down whenever it's needed. So without any guarantee for uptime. And Azure Batch is basically a way of doing a lot of compute distributed. So one of those ways is thinking about one of the use cases that I talked about recently was a client had a rendering program where they need to render something really CPU intensive. So they had like a server on premises with a lot of cores, like 50, 60 cores. And they did like huge 3D models, building, calculating all kinds of mathematic calculation. You could buy or rent in Azure a VM with a lot of cores, 64 cores or 128 cores, but you can expect to pay top dollar money for that solution. So if your workload can be divided, so cut into little pieces, and be calculated by little different VMs, so think of it like a bit like Bitcoin mining, if you will. So doing all kinds of little calculations. If you can cut up your calculations and you can queue them up, you can use Azure Batch. So what it basically is you have a little container where you store the work that needs to be done. And whenever Microsoft has, they call it low priority VMs. So that's VMs that again get a lower priority on that platform. So whenever other customers need more processing power, they take away your processing power, but you get a discount on your VMs. So it's basically best for workloads that you don't really mind that it happens right now. So if you get the answer, for example, if you have a big calculation, it doesn't really matter if it's done by 3 o'clock at night or 6 o'clock in the morning or 9 o'clock in the morning. You wake up, you get your coffee, and by the time it's 9 o'clock, you're behind your desk and you're looking at the result. You don't really care if it's done by 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, or 5 o'clock. As long as it's done by 9 o'clock, you're happy. So the low priority VM can be a great solution for that instance, but it's a bit of a niche case. You have to have the workload being able to cut up in little pieces and distribute it over all kinds of different servers, if you will. So yeah, that's basically cost optimization, if you will. All the different kinds of little tips and tricks. So if you combine a number of these tips or tricks, if you will, so by choosing the right subscription in the right region with the right VM size, and you use hybrid use benefit, and you also implement reserved instances, you can reduce the cost by 80, 90% in some cases. That's, of course, a bit of a utopia. It doesn't really happen that often, but it is possible to reduce your cost by at least 20% and often more towards 40%. So keep that in mind as sort of a baseline number, if you will. So yeah, any question, Matt?
Okay, this is my last question. So
Sure.
you showed some cool dashboards on cost management on Azure
Mhm.
Portal. So let's imagine that I want to create my own dashboard, for example, using Power BI. Is that possible?
Yeah, that is possible. What you can do is you can export specific data towards Power BI and basically build a data warehouse on that data and create your own cost management solution. Um, the reason why that exists was mostly because this solution wasn't really powerful some time ago, and it also wasn't always available for every user, every type of user. So, for instance, CSP users from the cloud resellers, they didn't have access to cost management. Only earlier this year, Microsoft introduced a new type of plan. I think it's called Azure Plan, where you can use the new, I think it's called the new management experience, where they get a direct insight into the cost they're making. Because earlier for CSP partners, it was basically like a blank check, if you will. You get the bill at the end of the month, and you have to pay it. And you just have to trust that it's the right amount. So all those charts that I gave you, for instance, for cost analysis on how you can save money and where you spend the most money, that wasn't even available for a number of subscription types. So this is in that case, it's new for some partners, but for others it really wasn't. So you could always export this data towards custom services, if you will. So if you want to, if for instance you have a Power BI platform for representing costs within your organization, you can export this data towards Power BI and get more insight or get more specific insights as to what you're trying to do, what your costs are for a specific item. I'm not really a Power BI guru, so I'm not really the most specific person to help you with the subject, but I do know people that do use Power BI to get an idea of cost. Yeah.
Okay, great. So that was a great session.
Mm-hmm.
So do you want to add something before we finished?
No, I'm not quite sure if there are any questions from the audience or if any questions came in.
Um, let's wait a couple of minutes if you want. Maybe
Hmm.
we have some questions.
Yeah, sure. If there are any viewers that have any questions, please let them know. Also, again, you can reach me on Twitter. I'm Martijn Brant on Twitter. You can always ping me on Twitter whenever you have any kinds of Azure questions or any related question to this session. Feel free to reach out, and if I don't know the answer, I'll reach out to someone who might know the answer. And like I said, this service is really constantly evolving to new things. So let me just quickly get the blog post for you, Azure Cost Management. So if you go to this URL, I'll link it. I don't know. Can we chat here? Let me just check. I'll send it in the private chat if Mert could send it
Okay.
in the public chat. People can look at this blog. I always recommend this blog thoroughly because it really gives good insights as to what's happening with Azure. So they have like an Azure blog that has all kinds of updates on all kinds of different services being used. Some of it's a bit more commercial story, if you will, but others are really technical. So if you have like a specific topic that you're really interested in, so for instance for cost management, then you'll get updates on what's new. So I know they're really currently working on an update for November, so expect that very soon, or in this blog where they specify the new solutions within cost management. So the things that are coming, the things that they deploy, and how you can further use that. So on the right, you get a topic overview. So for instance, if you're really deep into DevOps or a hybrid or whatever you want. So for instance, if monitoring is really important to you, be sure to check out this blog. It has all kinds of new things that you can discover or find out. So it's a really high level way of getting new updates. So for instance, introducing Azure Load Balancer Insights using Azure Monitor for networks. So if you're using Azure Monitor, it's a great way to learn about new features. But also if you're really into cost management, do check out their blog and their RSS feed to further improve on that.
Okay, great. So thank you very much for joining me today, and
Yeah,
hope to see
no
you
problem.
again on a new episode
Yeah,
next
well,
year.
we'll see. For now, yeah, I really want to thank you for inviting me on the show
You are
and giving
welcome.
me the opportunity to talk a bit about Azure and cost and all kinds of stuff related to that. So thank you again for the opportunity. And yeah, well, we'll see when we can schedule the next session.
Okay, thank you very much. So
All
see
right,
you soon.
thank you
Cheers.
very much. Bye bye.
Bye.